Hey, what's up? It's GC Kinsey, here to talk about an aspect of passing culture that's been on my mind a lot lately as a trans person. The nuance between passing versus not failing. In the current political situation that my fellow trans Americans and I are living in, where there's already been a massive rise in anti-trans legislation at the state level, and now there's a slew of anti-trans executive orders from the new presidential administration, something that gets brought up a lot is how these laws will cause the most harm to trans people who don't pass. And even before this big push in anti-trans laws, the same kind of conversation would come up around physical safety. Things like, you'll be fine going out in public as long as you pass, or I need to figure out how to pass so I don't have to watch my back. And in that same vein, people will say things like, passing is one of my transition goals so I can have a job without worrying about discrimination, have a relationship without my transness causing problems, live a normal life basically. There's a certain nuance that I've found is missing in most of these discussions, and that's what I want to cover in this video. But before I do, I want to give a little disclaimer that I'm actually not a fan of the term passing, something I've addressed in a previous video. I prefer to use the word perception instead of passing for talking about how trans people are seen because I don't like the implication that if you don't pass, you fail. But in this video, I'm going to have to use the word passing a lot for the sake of clarity, so fair warning, I guess. I also want to set some context for any of y'all who are going, okay, but what does passing even mean? There are two different ways that the word passing gets used in relation to trans people. The first one is that passing means people can't tell you're trans. They just see you as cis unless you tell them otherwise. So you might hear this definition of passing referred to more specifically as cis passing. And just to be clear, I'm talking about being seen as a cis person of your actual gender, not the one you were assigned at birth. So if you're a trans woman who's seen as a cis woman, or a trans man who's seen as a cis man, then you would be considered passing as cis. You'll notice that there's no real room for non-binary people under this definition of passing, because if people are seeing you as a cis man or a cis woman, then they're not seeing you as non-binary and vice versa. More on that later. The second definition is that passing simply means people are reading your gender correctly. It doesn't matter whether or not they see you as trans, it just matters that they see you as your gender. So this definition does include non-binary people. If you're a trans woman who's seen as a woman, or a trans man who's seen as a man, or a non-binary person who's seen as non-binary, then you would be considered passing as your gender. The main difference between these two definitions or uses of the word passing is that passing as your gender is about being seen correctly as who you are, whereas passing as a cis person of your gender is about being seen as someone who's in a more powerful social position than you actually are. A lot of times when people are talking about passing, they don't specify whether they mean passing as cis or passing as your gender, they just say passing, which can get confusing. Some people in the trans community also argue that cis passing is the only definition of passing, that it's impossible to be seen as a man or a woman without being seen as a cis man or a cis woman. And I don't agree with that at all personally, because one, I know a lot of people who are openly trans, visibly trans, and I still see them as their actual genders even though I'm aware they're not cis. And two, as a non-binary trans person, I kind of have to fundamentally disagree with the idea that cis passing is the only passing. So when we have these discussions about passing in the trans community, I wish more people would clarify which definition of passing they mean, because that's one nuance I feel is missing from these conversations. But the bigger nuance I think is missing, that I have literally never seen anyone mention, is the distinction between passing and not failing. Like I mentioned before, the reason I'm not a fan of the word passing is because it kind of has that pass-fail dichotomy built right into it. And not only does that feel shitty, knowing that when people say you don't pass, they're implying that your transition is failing in some way, I also just don't think it's that simple. I think that pass-fail dichotomy is just as much of a false binary as the gender binary itself. Moving through the world as a transmasculine NB whose gender isn't perceived in any sort of consistent way has taught me that. Passing isn't all or nothing. The same person might pass as their gender but not pass as cis, for example. Or they might pass as their gender sometimes but not other times. They might pass as cis sometimes but not other times. It might depend on the environment they're in and how people in that environment are taught to think about gender, or it might just be completely random. Also, some cis people don't even pass as cis people of their gender 100% of the time. And there's a gray area between passing and not passing that you can fall into, which I like to think of as not failing. What that looks like is maybe people don't see you correctly as your gender, aka you don't pass, but they don't see you incorrectly as your assigned gender either, aka you don't fail. And I have never heard anyone else in the trans community talk about passing versus not failing or frame things in that way, but that distinction is really important to me in terms of my transition goals, so that's why I'm making this video. I don't care about passing under either definition of the word, but I do care very much about not failing. And trying to explain that to anybody feels more or less impossible because they'll usually respond with, "So you actually do care about passing." They see passing as all or nothing. They believe in that pass-fail binary. And if that's what you happen to be thinking right now, if you're wondering how is not failing any different from passing, then here are some questions for you. If I'm transmasculine non-binary, then is it even possible to pass as my gender, or are most people going to shove me into one binary box or the other? If they shove me into the man box, is that close enough to count as passing as my gender because I'm masculine? Does it matter that I don't appreciate the non-binary erasure? If they see me as a cis man while they're shoving me into that man box, does that count as cis passing given that I'm not actually a man but a non-binary dude? Does it count as cis passing even if I don't want it to because I like being visibly and openly trans? And if someday I reach a point where no one sees me as a woman, but how they do see me varies. Some people see me as a trans man, some people see me as a cis man, some people just aren't sure. Maybe a handful of people do actually see me correctly as a transmasc NB, then what else would you call that but not failing? Because I clearly wouldn't be passing as cis or as my gender, but I wouldn't be failing, aka seen as my assigned gender either. And that's the goal right there. That's what I mean when I say that I don't care about passing, but I do care about not failing. My ultimate transition goal is to reach a point where I don't have to hear one more person call me ma'am ever again. I don't care whether people call me sir or whether they just don't gender me at all, like if they say have a good day instead of have a good day sir. I'm never gonna complain about anyone calling me sir because it gives me so much gender euphoria, but I also think we shouldn't be gendering strangers on principle. At the same time, I know we don't yet live in a world where that's the standard, which means I'm going to get gendered sometimes. And if I can't completely avoid getting gendered, I at least want to avoid getting misgendered. So that's what I mean by not failing as opposed to passing. I hope that all makes sense. There are two main reasons why not failing matters to me. First is dysphoria, because failing or being misgendered makes me extremely dysphoric, which not only sucks, it doesn't hurt as bad now as it used to pre-T, but it still sucks. It also causes a lot of cognitive dissonance, which is something I'll be talking about in my next video. And second is personal safety, especially in the current political climate, which was already getting increasingly transphobic here in the US before the current administration was sworn in, but now it's getting way worse way fast. I hate that I even have to think about safety this much, but the reality is that it's risky to exist in this world as a trans person, especially a visibly trans person. And there are certain situations where being misgendered in public, being addressed as a woman when I look like a dude, could draw attention to me in ways that put me in danger. So not failing would be great in the sense of not having to watch my back quite as hard. The distinction between passing versus not failing also ties into the enforcement of anti-trans laws such as bathroom bans, because there is no reliable way to enforce those laws, right? The only way you'll be reported for being in the wrong bathroom is if other people think you don't look like you belong there. And when I see a lot of discussions in trans circles about bathroom safety and bathroom laws, what I hear over and over is, if you're a passing trans woman, then you should be fine in the women's room. If you're a passing trans man, you should be fine in the men's room. You're lucky if they even bring up where non-binary people are supposed to be, but that's a whole other conversation. And like I said before, passing isn't all or nothing, so trying to apply a clear pass-fail binary to a situation like bathroom safety isn't going to be helpful for a lot of people. First of all, if you pass, you should be fine feels like a big f you to everybody who doesn't pass and never will. Like, are you just supposed to be stuck in the dysphoric abyss of using the wrong bathroom forever? And where does that advice leave people whose genders aren't perceived in a consistent way? Where does it leave people who aren't passing but also aren't failing? As a non-binary trans person who is gendered in different ways at different times and who hasn't even reached that point of not failing yet, trying to figure out how to use a public restroom safely and legally can be complicated. I avoid communal bathrooms and stick to single occupancy gender neutral ones when I can, but those aren't always available, so the women's room hasn't been an option for me for a long time, both for dysphoria and safety reasons. But if the men's room doesn't feel safe either, if I could get arrested for using it, if I don't have any friends who could go in with me and help watch my back, oh well, guess I'm holding it till I get home. It's bad enough that we live in a passing culture, that as trans people, we're not given basic respect unless we pass, as our genders at a bare minimum, but preferably as cis. It's bad enough that those of us who get misgendered a lot or are more visibly trans are more likely to face discrimination and violence. It's even worse when we have to contend with that and anti-trans laws. And that's why it's all the more important to talk about passing with the nuance it deserves. To understand that it's not as simple as an all or nothing pass-fail, even if that's what the word passing implies, and to address the complexities of how our genders are perceived and what that means for us in a largely transphobic world. Not only will that help us to understand and support each other better, it'll also help ensure that we're not leaving any of our siblings behind in the fight for trans rights and liberation. On that note, now is where I want to wrap things up and turn the conversation over to you. If you're part of the trans and non-binary community, what are your thoughts on passing and passing culture? What are your thoughts on gray areas like the distinction between passing versus not failing? Are there any other nuances around the concept of passing that you wish more people in the community were talking about? If you're not trans or non-binary, but you have other personal experience with passing around things like race or disability or mental illness, what kind of insight can you add? And for everyone, what questions do you have about all this? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I'm GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I've got more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, along with cosplay music videos, cosplay tutorials, a whole bunch of cool resources for singers about voice changes on testosterone, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for all of your support. I hope this gave you some good food for thought, and I will see you on the next one.